Silas stepped between the crooked gravestones and froze when he saw the massive vanguard warrior ripping at the frozen grave with her bare, bleeding hands. Mud flew from the pit in wet clumps as the orc woman tore into the ground like an animal trying to escape a trap. Several arrows stuck from her shoulder and side, their shafts trembling each time her body moved. She did not slow down. She clawed, scooped, and threw earth behind her, breathing in harsh bursts that carried across the quiet cemetery. Silas stood a few steps away, his lantern hanging low in his hand, its weak light sliding across the torn soil and the warrior's broad back. The grave she attacked had been dug earlier that day. Silas recognized the shape of the mound immediately. He had filled it himself. The rain had softened the soil, but the cold had hardened the deeper layer, forcing her to dig with brute force instead of speed. Each time her fingers struck the frozen layer, she growled and ripped harder, leaving streaks of dark blood across the mud. She looked enormous among the graves. Her shoulders rose higher than the marble markers nearby, and her arms moved with blunt strength that made the shovel leaning against Silas's shed suddenly seem small and delicate. The arrows in her body suggested a fight not far away. One arrow had broken halfway down the shaft, probably snapped when she forced herself through brush or stone walls. Silas did not shout. He did not run back toward the town. He simply lowered the lantern and watched. The warrior paused only once. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the pit, and pulled something heavy up from beside her. It was a long bundle wrapped in dark cloth and bound with thick cords. She dragged it closer to the open grave, careful now, moving slower than before. The bundle's shape left no confusion. A body. She dropped back into the hole and began digging again beside the wrapped form, deeper this time. Her movements had changed. The frantic ripping turned into deliberate scooping, widening the grave instead of tearing randomly through the soil. Even in the dim lantern light, Silas could see the difference between battle rage and burial work. The cemetery stretched around them in rows of stone markers and old iron fences. Most of the town avoided this place after dark. They said the ground here carried sickness. They said men who worked among graves lost their place among the living. Silas had heard every whisper. Tonight the empty cemetery felt even quieter, as if the dead themselves were watching the strange scene unfold. The orc did not notice him yet. She worked like someone racing a clock that only she could hear. Each movement grew slower. One of the arrows in her side shifted when she twisted, and fresh blood slid down into the mud. Her breath came louder now, fogging in the lantern glow as she forced her hands deeper into the frozen soil. Then the shovel struck the edge of the pit. Silas had stepped forward without noise and planted the iron blade beside her hands. The metal cut easily into the cold earth where her fingers had struggled. The orc jerked upright at once, spinning toward him with a sudden violent motion that sent mud flying. For a moment they stared at each other. She rose halfway out of the grave, towering over him even while wounded. Her broad chest lifted and fell with rough breathing. One hand hovered near the bone handle of a dagger hanging from her belt, though she had not drawn it yet. The broken arrow in her shoulder wobbled as her muscles tightened. Silas held the shovel out toward her. The lantern light showed his face clearly, thin, pale, dirt-stained from the evening's work. His coat hung loosely from narrow shoulders that carried none of the strength needed for a fight. His boots were caked with the same mud she had been digging through for the past hour. The shovel was clean. He had brought it straight from the shed. The orc's gaze dropped to the iron blade, then lifted back to his face. Her eyes narrowed. She studied him as if trying to understand what trap might hide behind such a simple gesture. Silas did not move. His arm remained extended. Rainwater slid down the wooden handle of the shovel and dripped from the metal edge into the open grave between them. The warrior's fingers slowly loosened from the dagger hilt. Her hand reached forward, but instead of taking the shovel, she grabbed the grave's edge and pulled herself fully out of the pit in one heavy motion. Mud slid down her arms as she stepped onto the grass. The ground trembled slightly under the impact of her boots. Now she stood directly in front of him, towering, wounded, and silent. Silas still held the shovel between them. Behind the orc, the wrapped body lay half inside the open grave. For a long moment, neither of them moved, the lantern light flickering across stone markers and wet earth. Then the warrior's bleeding hand finally closed around the iron handle. Corgal stopped digging the moment Silas stepped into the grave and drove the shovel into the frozen soil beside her. The iron blade bit deep with a dull crack, breaking the hard layer that had slowed her bleeding hands. Silas leaned his weight on the handle and forced another slice through the ground. Wet soil lifted easily now. He scooped it aside in heavy shovelfuls, tossing the dirt over the edge of the pit where the growing mound waited. Mud splashed against his boots, but he kept working with the slow rhythm of someone who had spent years moving earth for the dead. Corgal stood still inside the grave, staring at him. Her fingers twitched near the bone dagger at her belt. Every instinct pushed her to strike first. A lone human walking calmly into the pit of a wounded enemy made no sense in the rules she had lived by since childhood. Warriors did not pause for conversation with those they had invaded. Yet this man had stepped down beside her, without a weapon raised, without even looking at the arrows stuck in her flesh, as if they mattered. Silas drove the shovel down again. The metal struck stone with a sharp clang. He shifted the blade slightly and kept digging, widening the grave with practiced movements. Mud slid down the sides of the pit. Corgal's breath came rough and heavy through her teeth. Rainwater ran down her face, carrying thin lines of blood from the shallow cuts along her brow. She looked at the wrapped body lying at the edge of the grave, then back at the quiet human who continued working as if digging beside a wounded orc in the middle of the night was a normal task. Finally, her voice came out low and raw. "Why are you helping the enemy bury her dead?" Silas did not stop digging immediately. He lifted another heavy load of dirt and threw it aside before answering. "Because graves are my work." The reply was simple. No anger, no fear, just the quiet tone of someone explaining an obvious fact. He pushed the shovel into the ground again and pried loose another section of frozen soil. Corgal blinked slowly. The answer did not match anything she expected. Her clans taught that humans guarded their lands fiercely, especially the sacred soil where their dead rested. Any orc found digging here should have been surrounded by soldiers already. The alarm should have been ringing through the town by now. Yet the cemetery remained silent, except for the steady scrape of iron against dirt. Silas stepped back and wiped the mud from the shovel blade with his boot. Then he nodded toward the wrapped body beside the pit. "Bring him down. Ground is ready." Corgal hesitated. The arrows in her side shifted when she bent to lift the bundle. Pain tightened her movements, but she hid it behind slow, careful strength. The body rose easily in her arms. Even wrapped in cloth, it was clear how large the fallen warrior had been. She stepped down into the grave beside Silas and lowered the bundle gently onto the bottom of the pit. Silas watched the movement with a professional eye. He adjusted the dirt beneath the body with the shovel, leveling the ground so the fallen warrior would lie straight. He worked carefully around the cloth bundle, packing the soil firm so it would not shift later. Corgal noticed the care. Her people buried their dead differently, but respect for the fallen looked the same in any land. The human did not rush. He did not treat the body like an enemy prize. He handled the burial with the same steady attention he had given the digging. For a moment, the warrior simply watched his thin arms move the heavy shovel. Finally, she stepped back and climbed out of the grave again. The movement left a smear of blood on the edge of the pit where her hand gripped the earth. She stood guard above while Silas continued preparing the ground below. When he finished leveling the soil, he looked up at her and gave a small nod. "Lower him." Corgal crouched and lifted the wrapped body once more. Her muscles tightened as she carefully lowered the bundle down toward the waiting grave. Silas reached up to guide the weight. For an instant, the enormous warrior and the quiet gravedigger held the same burden between them in the rain, their hands touching the cloth that wrapped the fallen brother. And far beyond the cemetery walls, somewhere in the darkness of the road leading back to town, faint metal clinked against metal. Silas steadied the wrapped body as Corgal lowered it into the grave, his boots sliding slightly in the wet soil while he adjusted the bundle so it rested flat against the bottom of the pit. The cloth was soaked from the rain and heavy with mud, but the shape beneath remained carefully bound. Silas knelt beside it and brushed loose dirt away from the warrior's shoulders with the edge of the shovel blade. Corgal crouched above the grave, watching every movement with tight focus. Her breathing still came rough from blood loss and effort, yet she kept her posture controlled, as if any careless motion might dishonor the fallen man lying below them. Silas worked without hurry. He pulled small stones from the soil and tossed them aside so they would not press against the body once the grave was filled. Then he straightened the cloth around the warrior's chest where the binding cord had shifted during the digging. His hands moved with the careful rhythm of someone who had done this work many times before. Corgal noticed the difference immediately. Among her people, burials after battle were fast and harsh. Bodies were burned or covered quickly so the clan could move again before enemies returned. There was rarely time for neat graves or careful adjustments. Watching the human kneel in the mud and quietly arrange the ground beneath her brother created a strange stillness in her chest. Silas finally stepped back and nodded once. The gesture was small, but clear. Corgal climbed down into the grave again. Her boots landed beside the body with a dull thud, sinking slightly into the damp soil. She knelt beside her brother and untied the final knot securing the cloth around his face. The fabric peeled back slowly. A broad, green face appeared beneath the wrap. The fallen warrior's tusks were chipped from battle. One eye remained half closed where a wound had darkened the skin around it. Corgal brushed the mud from his brow with the side of her hand. Silas looked away for a moment, giving her the space. Corgal rested her palm against the center of the dead warrior's chest. Her shoulders lowered slightly as if the motion released the last tension she had carried since dragging the body across enemy lands. She spoke then, her voice deep and steady, forming slow words in the harsh rhythm of the orc tongue. The sounds rolled through the graveyard like low thunder, not loud, but heavy enough to settle between the rows of stone markers. Silas did not understand the language, but he understood the purpose. The chant lasted only a short while. When the final word faded, Corgal pulled the cloth back over her brother's face and retied the cord. She rose to her feet, towering within the narrow grave, then looked toward Silas. He handed her the shovel without speaking. The orc hesitated, studying the iron tool again, as if the simple object still carried some hidden trick. Finally, she pushed the shovel back toward him with a slow motion of her hand. "Your ground," she said quietly. Silas gave a short shrug and drove the blade into the soil beside the pit. Dirt slid forward in heavy loads as he began filling the grave. Each shovelful landed with a dull thump against the wrapped body below. Corgal remained inside the pit, using her hands to spread the soil evenly so the weight settled properly around the fallen warrior. They worked together without speaking. Mud covered Silas's sleeves to the elbows. Corgal's bleeding fingers pressed the earth firmly along the sides of the grave. The steady rhythm of shovel and hand replaced the earlier frenzy of digging. Slowly, the wrapped shape disappeared beneath layers of dark soil. When the grave was nearly full, Silas stepped back and pushed the last mound forward with the flat of the shovel. The earth rose slightly above the ground level, forming the familiar hump of a fresh burial. Rain tapped softly against the mound. Corgel climbed out of the grave again. Her boots landed beside Silas, leaving deep prints in the wet grass. She stared at the new mound of soil for a long moment. Silas planted the shovel upright in the ground beside the grave and pressed the dirt down with his boot to firm the edges. The quiet lasted only a few breaths. Then Corgel swayed. The arrow buried in her side shifted sharply as her body tilted. Her hand reached for the shovel handle, but missed. The massive warrior staggered once, her knees buckling under the weight she had carried too long. Silas dropped the shovel and lunged forward just as the towering orc began to collapse toward the muddy ground. Silas caught Corgel's arm as her knees gave out, the sudden weight nearly pulling him face first into the mud beside the fresh grave. Her body folded heavily against him. The impact drove the air from his lungs and forced him to brace his boots hard into the wet ground to keep both of them from falling. One of the arrows in her shoulder scraped against his coat as she slumped forward. The shaft trembled, and a thin stream of blood ran down along the leather of her armor. Silas tightened his grip under her arm and tried to pull her upright, but the difference in their size made the effort look almost foolish. Corgel's head hung low. Her breath came in deep, uneven pulls that shook her chest. For a moment she tried to push herself away from him, as if pride alone might keep her standing. Her legs refused to answer. Her body sagged again, and this time she did not try to hide the weakness. Silas shifted his stance and dragged her arm across his shoulders. The movement was clumsy and slow. Her weight pressed down on him so heavily that his boot sank deeper into the soft soil. He leaned sideways, struggling to find balance while guiding her away from the grave. Each step required effort. The cemetery paths were narrow and uneven, and the mud made every movement uncertain. Corgel's boots scraped the ground behind them. She tried to walk. Once or twice her legs pushed forward enough to help, but the strength faded quickly. Her head lowered against his shoulder as the blood loss caught up with her. The massive warrior who had torn through frozen soil minutes earlier now moved like a wounded animal, barely staying on its feet. Silas did not speak. He focused on the path ahead. The small stone cabin he used as both shed and shelter stood near the far edge of the cemetery. It had once been a burial crypt before the town abandoned it decades ago. Now it held his tools, a narrow bed, and the small iron stove he used during cold nights. The distance felt longer than usual. Silas adjusted his grip several times as they moved. Once he slipped on a patch of wet grass and nearly lost both of them. His hand shot out and grabbed the side of a stone monument to steady himself. Corgel's weight sagged harder across his shoulders, but somehow he managed to keep them upright. The arrows made the journey worse. Each step jostled the shafts buried in her armor. The broken arrow along her side scraped against the edge of the metal plate protecting her ribs. The movement forced another weak breath from her throat, though she still made no complaint. They reached the small stone building at last. Silas kicked the door open with his boot and half-dragged, half-guided the warrior inside. The interior was cramped, barely large enough for two people to move comfortably, and the sudden arrival of the enormous orc filled most of the space immediately. He lowered her carefully onto the wooden floor beside the narrow bed. Corgel collapsed onto her side with a dull thud. For a moment she simply lay there, her breathing loud in the quiet room. Mud covered her armor and arms. Blood from the arrow wounds had begun to soak into the wooden boards beneath her. Silas moved quickly now. He grabbed the small lantern hanging from a hook and turned the wick higher. The stronger light revealed the damage clearly. One arrow had passed through the thick leather at her shoulder and lodged shallowly beneath the armor plate. Another had struck her side at a sharper angle. The shaft snapped halfway along its length. Silas crouched beside her and reached toward the arrow in her shoulder. Corgil's hand shot up instantly and caught his wrist. Even weakened, the grip was strong enough to stop him completely. Her eyes opened halfway, focusing on his face through strands of wet hair. The warrior studied him again with the same hard suspicion she had shown at the grave. Silas did not pull away. He simply held the small knife he had taken from the work table and pointed at the arrow shaft. Corgil looked down at the weapon in his hand, then at the arrow. Her fingers loosened slowly. Silas nodded once and leaned closer to examine the wound, the lantern light casting long shadows across the stone walls. Outside the small crypt cabin, the cemetery remained quiet, but somewhere beyond the foggy rows of gravestones, faint laughter drifted through the night air. Corgil slowly reached for the bone dagger at her belt, while Silas pressed a folded cloth against the arrow wound in her shoulder. The blade came free with a dry scrape against the leather sheath. Silas noticed the movement immediately and paused, his hand still holding the cloth firmly against the bleeding wound. The lantern light reflected along the pale bone handle as the orc lifted the dagger between them. For a moment it looked exactly like the beginning of an attack. Her arm moved with the controlled strength of a trained warrior, and the short blade pointed toward his chest. Silas did not move away. His free hand rested on the wooden floor beside him. The small knife he had used to cut the cloth lay near his knee, but he did not reach for it. Instead, he kept the pressure on her shoulder wound, steady and careful so the bleeding would not start again. Corgil watched his face. The dagger remained raised. Her eyes moved from the cloth pressed against her shoulder to the quiet human kneeling beside her. The difference in their size was obvious even here on the floor of the cramped crypt cabin. If she had wanted to strike, the blade would already be buried in him. The seconds passed slowly. Finally, she turned the dagger in her hand and offered it toward him, the handle first. Silas blinked once in quiet surprise. The weapon was old, but well kept. The handle had been carved from a long, pale bone and smoothed by years of use. Small markings covered the grip, shallow cuts that formed careful patterns running along its length. They were not random decoration. Even without knowing the language, Silas recognized the shape of names and symbols carved into the surface. Corgil spoke quietly, her voice still rough from exhaustion. "My brother's blade." Silas looked at the dagger again. She pushed it a little closer toward him. "For the stone." Understanding settled slowly. Silas glanced toward the door of the cabin where the graveyard waited outside in the darkness. Every burial he handled ended with a marker. Sometimes it was a carved stone if the family could afford it. Other times it was only a wooden plank hammered into the soil with a name scratched across the surface. Corgil's brother had nothing. No stone, no marker, only a mound of fresh earth in enemy land. Silas wiped the mud from his hand against his coat before carefully accepting the dagger. The bone handle felt solid and heavy despite its size. The carvings along the grip had been made with care, each line cut deep and precise by someone who understood the importance of the symbols. Corgil watched the exchange closely. The moment held weight beyond the small room. In her world, a warrior's blade was rarely given away, especially to an outsider. Weapons carried honor, history, and the memory of those who had fought with them. Handing the dagger to a human gravedigger should have felt like betrayal. Yet she had placed the handle directly into his palm. Silas turned the blade slowly in the lantern light. The edge was sharp enough for carving. He nodded once, a quiet promise without words. Then he set the dagger carefully on the small table beside the bed and returned to the wound in her shoulder. The arrow had to come out. He examined the shaft closely, testing how deeply it had lodged beneath the armor plate. Corgel shifted slightly as he touched the wound, her teeth tightening for a brief moment before she forced her body still again. The warrior did not speak, but her hand closed around the edge of the wooden floorboards. Silas snapped the arrow shaft shorter with a quick twist to make the removal easier. Then he braced his hand against her shoulder and pulled. The arrow slid free in a single motion. Blood followed the metal tip immediately, dark against the cloth he pressed against the wound. Corgel's body jerked once, her breath leaving her chest in a sharp burst. But she did not cry out. Silas quickly folded another strip of cloth and tied it tightly around her shoulder to hold the pressure. The room grew quiet again. On the table beside them, the bone dagger rested under the lantern light, waiting for the name that would soon be carved into stone outside. Corgel crushed the stem of the first lily she tried to place into the small clay vase on Silas's table. The soft green stalk snapped between her fingers with a quiet crack. She froze immediately, staring at the broken flower lying across her palm as if she had just split a blade instead of a fragile plant. The cabin was silent, except for the faint hiss of the iron stove and the slow ticking of rain against the stone roof. Corgel carefully lowered the ruined lily onto the table, her large hand moving with exaggerated caution, as if even the wood might shatter under too much pressure. Silas watched from the doorway while carrying a small bucket of water from the cemetery well. Mud still clung to his boots and coat from the night before, though the storm had finally passed and the fog outside had thinned into pale morning light between the gravestones. He stepped inside and set the bucket beside the door without comment, his eyes briefly glancing at the snapped flower. Corgel cleared her throat and reached for another lily from the bundle lying on the table. The white petals looked almost weightless against her thick fingers. She held the stem as if it were made of thin glass, adjusting her grip again and again before slowly guiding it toward the vase. Her hands trembled slightly from the effort of controlling strength that usually moved heavy weapons instead of flowers. This time the stem survived. The lily slipped into the water and leaned gently against the side of the vase. Corgel released it and immediately pulled her hand back as if expecting it to break anyway. When the flower remained standing, her shoulders loosened just a little. Silas walked over to the table and placed 3 more lilies beside the vase. "They grow near the west wall," he said quietly while wiping his hands on a cloth. "People bring them sometimes, for the newer graves." Corgel looked at the growing arrangement of white flowers. The sight seemed to confuse her more than any weapon or battle tactic might have. She lifted another lily and studied the thin stem carefully before placing it beside the first one with the same slow caution. Her shoulder was wrapped tightly in clean cloth now. The bandage ran beneath her armor straps and across her back, holding the wound closed where the arrow had been removed. The second arrow had come out earlier that morning after Silas worked it free with careful hands and a short iron tool. The injury still limited her movement, but she had refused to remain on the narrow bed any longer than necessary. Warriors did not lie still while others worked. Silas picked up the broken lily from the table and trimmed the crushed end of the stem with a small knife. He placed it gently into the vase beside the others. The flower leaned slightly sideways but remained upright in the water. Corgel watched the simple repair closely. Her massive hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers spread wide as if afraid to touch anything else. The small clay vase looked tiny between them. When she reached for the next flower, she slowed her movement again, guiding the stem into place with careful patience. Outside the cabin, rows of gravestones stretched through the pale morning fog. The fresh mound where her brother rested had settled slightly overnight, the dark soil still loose around the edges. Corgel's eyes shifted toward the door. Silas noticed the look and nodded once. "Stone comes later," he said, gesturing toward the bone dagger lying on the workbench. "Carving takes time." Corgel glanced at the dagger. The pale handle reflected a dull line of light from the window slit in the stone wall. Her jaw tightened slightly before she returned her attention to the lilies. She lifted the final flower from the bundle. This time the stem did not break. The vase now held a small cluster of white petals rising above the table. The arrangement leaned unevenly, clearly placed by hands more familiar with war than quiet rooms. Corgal stared at it for several seconds, her head tilting slightly as if trying to understand why something so delicate required so much effort. Silas stepped back toward the door and grabbed his iron crowbar from beside the well bucket. The heavy tool rested easily in his grip after years of lifting stubborn grave markers and prying old stone from frozen ground. Behind him, the enormous orc warrior carefully adjusted the angle of one final lily. Then, faint but clear, laughter drifted through the fog outside the cemetery gates. Corgal wrapped both hands around the edge of the marble monument and lifted. The stone slab rose from the ground with a deep grinding sound as the base broke free from the soil that had held it for years. Silas stepped back quickly, his boots scraping the gravel path while the tall marker tilted sideways in the warrior's grip. The monument had taken him nearly half a day to shift the last time it needed adjusting, and even then he had managed only a few inches before exhaustion forced him to stop. Now the enormous orc held the weight against her chest, as if it were nothing more than a wooden plank. She turned carefully and lowered the stone onto the grass beside the grave. The heavy block landed with a dull thump that shook the nearby markers. Corgal immediately crouched and brushed loose dirt away from the base, clearing the ground with quick scoops of her hands. The movement was precise despite her size. She did not rush. She worked with the same controlled strength she had used in battle, but now the target was only a crooked monument that had slowly sunk into the earth over the years. Silas stood nearby, holding a measuring rod made from an old shovel handle. His coat hung open in the cool air, and a thin line of dust marked his sleeves where he had been chiseling earlier that morning. He watched the warrior shift the heavy stone again, sliding it across the grass until it aligned with the edge of the grave. "Little to the left," he said quietly. Corgal paused, then pushed the base of the monument sideways a few inches. The marble scraped softly against the soil. Silas stepped closer and squinted along the line of markers stretching through the cemetery row. Each grave followed the same careful pattern. The stones faced the same direction, so the morning sun touched every name equally. It was a small rule the townspeople rarely noticed, but Silas had kept the order for years out of habit. He nodded. "Good." Corgal lifted the stone again and lowered it back onto the prepared base. The monument settled firmly into place. She released it slowly, making sure the weight rested evenly before stepping back. Silas tapped the side of the stone with the wooden rod. The marker did not shift. He allowed a small breath to escape through his nose. That was the closest thing he came to praise. Corgal rolled her shoulder carefully under the bandage wrapped beneath her armor straps. The movement tested the wound where the arrow had been removed 2 days earlier. Her expression tightened slightly, but she ignored the discomfort and looked toward the next grave marker that had leaned crooked for nearly a year. Silas followed her gaze. "That one, too," he said. Corgal walked toward the second monument. The marker was even larger than the first, a thick block of white marble that had slowly tilted forward after the soil beneath it softened during winter rains. Silas had tried to repair it several times using wedges and wooden supports. None of the attempts had lasted long. Corgal bent down and slid her fingers beneath the base. Silas instinctively stepped aside again as she lifted. The stone rose from the ground with another deep, scraping sound. Bits of dirt crumbled away from the underside as she turned and set the monument down beside the grave. The movement was smooth, controlled, and far quicker than anything Silas could have managed alone. He watched with quiet attention. For years, the cemetery had been a place of slow work. Every stone took time. Every grave required patience and effort from his thin arms and simple tools. Seeing the massive warrior move the heavy markers so easily changed the rhythm of the place. Corgal crouched again, clearing the ground where the monument would sit. Her hands scooped away loose soil while Silas used the iron crowbar to pry out a stubborn rock beneath the surface. Their movements began to match. Silas loosened the ground. Corgal lifted the weight. The cemetery slowly straightened around them as the crooked markers returned to their proper lines. After several minutes, Corgal set the second monument upright in its place. Silas stepped back to check the alignment again. Rows of white stone now stood straight where they had leaned before. The graves looked orderly for the first time in months. Corgal rested her hands on her knees and glanced across the cemetery. The quiet field of markers stretched toward the far gate where a narrow dirt road led back toward town. Silas followed her gaze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, faint but unmistakable, the distant sound of metal coins clinking together drifted through the fog near the cemetery entrance. Silas sat on the small wooden porch outside the stone cabin, while Corgal lowered herself onto the step beside him, the boards creaking softly under her weight. The evening fog had returned to the cemetery, spreading between the rows of gravestones like pale smoke drifting low across the ground. Silas held a small metal cup in both hands, letting the warmth of the tea seep into his fingers. Corgal sat beside him with her long legs stretched out across the dirt path, one boot resting against the edge of a crooked stone marker that Silas had not yet repaired. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Silas took a slow drink from the cup and set it beside him on the porch. The quiet of the graveyard felt familiar to him. The dead never asked questions. They never mocked his work or his place among them. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees while watching the fog curl around the distant graves. Corgal studied the same silent field. Her presence on the narrow porch looked almost unnatural. The structure had been built for a single caretaker, not a towering warrior whose shoulders nearly brushed the low stone doorway behind them. One of her hands rested against the porch boards, fingers spread wide as if testing the fragile wood. Silas reached down and picked up a small carving tool from beside the door. The thin chisel still held traces of pale marble dust from earlier work. He rolled the tool slowly between his fingers before speaking in a quiet voice. "People in town say the graveyard is dirty work." Corgal turned her head slightly. Silas shrugged and pointed loosely toward the rows of gravestones. "They don't like the man who lives with the dead." The statement came out flat and simple, without bitterness. His coat sleeves were still marked with stone dust and dried mud from the day's labor. The thin fabric looked worn at the elbows where years of digging had rubbed the cloth smooth. Corgal watched him carefully. In her clans, the warriors who carried bodies from battle were honored. The dead were treated with fierce respect. No one called the burial workers unclean. Yet the quiet human beside her spoke of the work as if it had pushed him outside the walls of his own people. Silas lifted the carving tool and gestured toward the small workbench inside the cabin, where the bone dagger lay beside a block of pale stone. "But the dead are easier company," he added. Corgal tilted her head slightly at the remark. Silas continued turning the tool between his fingers. "They don't laugh." The words hung quietly in the fog. Corgal looked back across the cemetery. The graves stood in careful rows, many with carved markers, some with simple stones, and a few with nothing more than wooden boards. Her brother's grave rested among them now, the soil still darker where the earth had been turned only days earlier. Her hand moved slowly to the bandage beneath her armor strap, pressing lightly against the wound in her side. Among the orc clans, weakness brought challenges. Injured warriors were expected to recover quickly, or step aside. Mercy rarely lasted long in places ruled by strength. The human beside her had not asked for anything in return for his help. He had not treated her like an enemy either. The silence stretched again. Silas reached for the metal cup and took another drink. A small wisp of steam rose into the cool evening air. When he finished, he set the cup down between them. Corgal looked at the cup, then at the thin human sitting beside her. The porch creaked quietly when she shifted her weight. "Clans mock weak ones too," she said at last. Her voice remained low and steady, but the statement carried the blunt honesty of someone who did not bother softening harsh truths. Silas nodded slightly. Neither of them added anything else. The fog thickened around the graves, swallowing the far rows of markers until only the nearest stones remained visible from the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a loose gate chain tapped softly against iron. Then, faint and distant, the sound of rough laughter rolled through the fog beyond the cemetery walls. Corgo leaned back against the stone wall of the cabin and drew a slow breath before letting the first note of the chant roll out of her chest. The sound was deep and steady, almost like distant thunder traveling through the ground instead of the air. Silas sat on the porch step with the small carving chisel resting in his hand, the half-shaped stone marker balanced between his boots. The first low tone vibrated through the quiet cemetery and settled between the rows of gravestones. It was not loud, but the weight of it filled the fog around them. Corgo continued the chant without pause. Each line rose slowly and then dropped again, forming a rhythm that sounded older than the stones around them. Her voice carried the rough edges of a warrior who had spent years shouting across battlefields. Yet now the sound came controlled and deliberate. The words were in the orc tongue, harsh and heavy, but the pace was calm. It was a burial song. Silas listened while carving. The chisel tapped softly against the pale stone with careful strikes. Small flakes of marble fell onto the dirt between his boots. The bone dagger rested nearby, its blade used earlier to mark the lines where the letters would go. Silas did not understand the language of the chant, but the meaning behind it was clear enough. It carried the same tone as the quiet prayers some families spoke during burials in the town. Corgal's voice shifted into a lower tone as the chant continued. The sound traveled across the cemetery and brushed against the older graves. Fog curled around the stone markers, while the deep notes rolled slowly between them. For a moment, the place no longer felt like a human burial ground alone. The heavy rhythm of the chant blended with the stillness of the cemetery, as if two traditions had quietly stepped into the same space. Silas paused his carving and lifted the stone marker slightly to check the shape of the letters. The name had been marked carefully using the bone dagger earlier in the day while Corgal watched from the porch. The symbols were not human writing. They curved and angled in patterns that matched the carvings along the dagger's handle. He placed the chisel against the stone again and continued cutting along the lines. Tap, tap, tap. Each strike followed the rhythm of the chant without him realizing it. The sound of metal against marble formed a soft counterbeat to the deep tones rising from Corgal's chest. Corgal noticed. Her eyes shifted toward the human working beside the graveyard path. For a brief moment the chant slowed as she listened to the small taps of the chisel echo through the fog. The rhythm matched closely enough that the two sounds blended together. Then she continued the chant. The song carried longer now, each line stretching deeper before fading. The air between the gravestones felt heavier with every verse. The cemetery did not resist the foreign sound. The fog simply carried it farther between the rows. Silas brushed marble dust from the stone and turned it slightly to carve the final marks along the bottom edge. The name now stood clearly across the surface, in sharp lines cut by careful hands. He ran his fingers across the grooves to check their depth. Corgal's chant began to slow. The last verse came out softer than the others. Her voice dropped into a low rumble that faded gradually into silence. The sound drifted through the fog one final time and disappeared among the distant graves. Silas set the chisel down. The cemetery felt very quiet again. He lifted the finished stone marker with both hands and carried it toward the fresh mound where her brother lay buried. The soil had settled enough for the base to hold the weight. He pressed the stone into the ground carefully, adjusting it until it stood straight like the others in the row. Corgal rose from the wall and walked toward the grave. She stopped beside Silas and studied the carved name on the marker. Her large hand moved slowly across the stone, tracing the sharp lines cut into the marble. The gesture was careful, almost gentle, despite the strength behind it. Silas stepped back to give her space. The fog thickened again around the cemetery paths. Somewhere beyond the gate, faint metal clinked against metal, followed by the rough sound of men laughing. The sound of coins clinking together drifted through the fog as Silas lifted his lantern and turned toward the cemetery gate. The noise carried easily in the quiet night. It came with heavy footsteps and the rough laughter of men who did not bother lowering their voices. Silas stood beside the freshly placed gravestone for a moment, the lantern light flickering across the carved letters before he began walking slowly toward the entrance path. Corgal remained near her brother's grave, her large hand still resting against the stone marker as she listened. The laughter grew louder. Silas recognized the sound before he even saw the shapes moving through the fog. The town guards sometimes came through the cemetery at night, but their patrols were usually quiet. These voices carried a different tone. The loose jingle of coin pouches and the careless clatter of metal tools told him exactly what kind of visit this was. Grave robbers. They wore the guard uniforms when it suited them, but the work they did here had little to do with protecting the town. Silas had seen the signs before. Graves opened and closed again before morning. Jewelry missing from fresh burials. Coffins disturbed where no family had returned. He slowed his steps as the fog parted near the iron gate. 3 men stood just inside the entrance, their shapes outlined by a lantern hanging from the hook of the cemetery fence. One guard leaned against the iron bars while shaking a small pouch in his hand, the coins inside clinking together with each motion. Another carried a short shovel over his shoulder. The third man crouched beside an older grave, scraping dirt away from the base of the marker with a narrow pry bar. Silas stopped several paces away. The lantern in his hand cast a narrow circle of light across the ground. Mud clung to his boots from the evening work. His coat hung loosely from his thin frame, making him look even smaller against the stone rows behind him. One of the guards noticed him first. "Well, look here," the man said with a crooked grin, straightening from the grave he had been inspecting. "The dirt keeper himself." The other 2 turned. Silas did not answer immediately. His gaze moved from the pry bar in the man's hand to the loose mound of soil beside the disturbed grave. The marker leaned slightly where it had been forced aside. "Ground's closed tonight," Silas said quietly. The guard with the coin pouch laughed again and tossed the bag lightly from one hand to the other. "Ground's always open if you know where to dig." The second guard stepped forward and planted the shovel blade into the soil with a dull crunch. "Relax, Silas. We're just checking a few things." Silas glanced down the cemetery rows behind him. The fog hid most of the graves, but he knew exactly where the fresh mound stood. The new stone marker with the orc name carved across it rested not far from the path. Corgal remained there. The guards had not seen her yet. Silas lifted the lantern slightly, shifting the light so it pointed away from the deeper part of the cemetery. His free hand rested loosely against the iron crowbar hanging from his belt. The man with the pry bar began walking farther into the graveyard. "Fresh dirt somewhere around here," he muttered while scanning the rows of stones. "Smells like easy coin." Silas stepped forward to block the narrow path between the markers. The guards stopped and looked down at him with a slow smile. Behind them, deeper in the fog, a massive shape moved silently between the gravestones. Corgel stepped out from the fog between the gravestones and began tightening the leather straps of her armor while the guards argued with Silas near the path. The movement was quiet but deliberate. Her fingers pulled the worn straps snug across her chest, securing the plates that protected her ribs and shoulder. The bandage beneath the armor tugged slightly against the healing wound where the arrow had struck, but she ignored the pull. Her eyes remained fixed on the three men standing near the cemetery gate. Even from the distance, she could hear the sharp tone of their voices drifting through the fog. Silas stood in front of them with the lantern hanging low in one hand. The weak light cast long shadows across the gravel path. His other hand rested near the iron crowbar hooked through his belt. He looked small beside the guards. Their armor and weapons carried the authority of the town, even if the men wearing them had come here for reasons that had nothing to do with law. One guard leaned on his shovel and nodded toward the darker rows of graves deeper in the cemetery. "Fresh dirt out there somewhere," he said with a crooked grin. "We'll have a quick look." Silas shook his head slowly. "Ground's closed." The guard with the coin pouch laughed again and gave the bag a careless shake, the metal clinking inside. "You don't own the dead, Silas." Behind the gravestones, Corgel watched the exchange. Her instincts were simple. Step out, draw the dagger, strike before the enemy could react. That was the rule she had followed in every battle since she first carried a weapon. Her hand moved toward the empty sheath at her belt out of habit before stopping. The bone dagger was no longer there. She had given it away. Her gaze shifted across the cemetery row to the fresh mound where her brother lay buried. The carved stone marker stood straight above the grave, the letters cut carefully into the marble by the quiet human now facing three armed men alone. Corgel's fingers tightened briefly against the armor strap. The fog shifted slightly, revealing the open space between the gravestones. From where she stood, she could reach the path in only a few long strides. The guards would see her immediately. The fight would begin before Silas could step aside. She exhaled slowly and moved closer to the edge of the fog. Silas still blocked the path, his thin frame planted between the guards and the deeper rows of graves. The lantern in his hand flickered as a faint breeze drifted through the cemetery. The guard with the pry bar stepped forward. "Move aside," he said. Silas did not move. The man's smile faded. He lifted the pry bar slightly and tapped the metal tip against the ground. The dull clang echoed through the quiet cemetery. Corgel's muscles tightened. This was the moment when warriors usually charged. Instead, she stepped backward. The fog swallowed her shape again as she moved deeper among the gravestones. Her boots avoided the gravel path, choosing the softer ground between the markers where her steps made almost no sound. Silas remained in place. The guards' attention stayed fixed on the thin gravedigger standing stubbornly in their way. They did not notice the silent movement behind them among the rows of stone. Corgel reached the side wall of the small stone cabin and placed one heavy hand against the rough surface. The building stood only a short distance from the fresh grave and the narrow path leading through the cemetery. Its flat roof rose just above the nearby monuments. She looked once more toward Silas. The guard with the pry bar lifted his arm again, this time pointing the metal tool directly toward the deeper graves. Silas unhooked the iron crowbar from his belt and held it in both hands. The lantern light flickered between them. Above the cabin door, Corgel placed one foot against the wall and began climbing silently toward the roof. Silas blew out his lantern, and the cemetery fell into darkness so quickly that the guards cursed and stepped back from the path. The small flame vanished with a soft hiss, leaving only the dim glow of the lantern still hanging near the iron gate. Fog rolled through the gravestones, swallowing the weak light and turning the narrow paths into pale shadows between darker shapes. Silas stood still for a moment, the iron crowbar heavy in his hands while the guards tried to understand what had just happened. "Idiots snuffed the light," one of them muttered. Another laughed under his breath. "Doesn't matter. Fresh dirt doesn't hide." They stepped forward anyway. The man with the shovel kicked the loose lantern on the fence slightly so its light pointed deeper into the cemetery. The beam slid across crooked stones and damp soil, but could not reach far through the fog. Silas had already moved away from the path. His boots sank quietly into the softer ground between graves while he slipped into the pale mist. The guards followed. They did not move carefully. Their armor clinked with every step, and their boots crushed gravel loudly along the path. One of them dragged the shovel behind him, the metal blade scraping against the stones. Silas crouched behind a tall monument several rows ahead. He knew the cemetery better than any living person. Every dip in the ground, every unstable stone, every pit left open during unfinished burials. His breath came slow and quiet while he watched the faint lantern glow wobble closer through the fog. One guard walked ahead of the others, scanning the ground with the tip of his pry bar. "There," he said suddenly, pointing toward a mound of darker soil not far from the path. Silas's hand tightened around the crowbar. The guard stepped forward, but the fog hid the edge of a half-dug pit only a few feet away. The grave had been started earlier in the day and left unfinished while Silas waited for the coffin that had never arrived. Rain had softened the soil around it, leaving the ground unstable. The man took one more step. His boot slid forward and the earth collapsed beneath him. He dropped suddenly with a shout, disappearing waist-deep into the open grave. Dirt crumbled around his legs while the pry bar flew from his hands and clattered across a nearby stone. The other two guards rushed toward him. "What did you do?" one barked while grabbing the fallen man's arm. Silas moved. He rushed from behind the monument with the awkward speed of someone who had never fought before but knew exactly where to strike. The iron crowbar swung in a wide arc and slammed against the shovel blade the second guard had just lifted. The impact rang sharply through the fog. The guard staggered back, surprised more than hurt. Silas nearly lost his balance from the swing. The heavy tool dragged his arm downward and forced him to stumble sideways into a gravestone. His shoulder hit the cold marble hard enough to knock the breath from his chest. The guard recovered quickly. He lunged forward, grabbing the front of Silas's coat and shoving him backward toward the open pit where the first man still struggled in the loose dirt. "Stupid grave rat," the guard growled. Silas swung the crowbar again, but the motion was clumsy. The metal tool clipped the guard's forearm instead of his shoulder, forcing the man to release his grip but not stopping him completely. The second guard raised the shovel high. For a moment, the lantern light near the gate flickered through the fog and revealed the fragile human standing alone among three armed men. Then something heavy dropped from above the mausoleum roof behind them. Corgle dropped from the roof of the mausoleum and hit the ground behind the guards with a heavy thud that rattled the nearby gravestones. The impact sent loose dirt sliding across the path. One guard spun around instantly, the shovel still raised above his head, but the sight of the towering orc standing in the fog froze him for a split second. Corgle did not waste the moment. Her arm shot forward and seized the wooden handle of the shovel just below the blade. The guard tried to yank it back, but the motion barely moved her arm. With a sharp twist of her wrist, she ripped the tool free from his grip and flung it aside where it clattered against a stone marker. Silas stumbled backward during the struggle, his boots sliding on wet gravel. The iron crowbar hung awkwardly in his hands while he struggled to catch his balance. He did not look like a fighter. His coat was crooked where the guard had grabbed him, and one sleeve had torn slightly near the elbow. Yet he remained standing between the guards and the deeper rows of graves. The man trapped in the open pit cursed loudly while trying to pull his legs free from the loose soil. The remaining guard recovered first. He lunged at Corgal with both arms, aiming to tackle her before she could move again. The difference in size made the attempt look reckless. Corgal stepped sideways, letting his momentum carry him forward. Her hand struck the back of his armor and shoved him hard toward the edge of the half-dug grave. The guard stumbled and dropped to one knee beside the pit, barely catching himself before falling in beside his companion. Silas used the distraction. He swung the crowbar again, this time aiming lower. The iron bar struck the ground near the guard's boot and hooked beneath the loose plank that covered the edge of the pit. With a desperate pull, he yanked the board sideways. The wood slid free, and the ground beneath the kneeling guard shifted instantly. The man lost his footing. He pitched forward with a shout and vanished into the pit beside the first guard, both of them now tangled together in the soft soil. Dirt collapsed around their legs while they struggled to climb out of the narrow hole. The third guard backed away slowly. His eyes moved between the enormous warrior standing in the fog and the thin gravedigger gripping the crowbar like someone who barely knew how to use it. The laughter from earlier had vanished completely. Even the fog seemed to hold still around them. Corgal stepped forward. Her movements were controlled and direct, the discipline of a trained warrior guiding every step. She did not charge wildly or shout threats. She simply placed herself between Silas and the guards struggling in the pit. Her injured shoulder remained stiff beneath the armor, but her posture stayed firm. The guard, still standing, raised his hands slightly. "We were just—" Corgal cut him off with a single short motion of her arm, pointing toward the cemetery gate. Silas took a slow breath beside her. The crowbar trembled faintly in his grip, his arms still tense from the awkward fight. Mud covered the front of his coat and one knee where he had nearly fallen. Behind them, the fresh gravestones stood silent among the rows of markers. The two men trapped in the pit finally managed to climb halfway out, their armor caked with wet soil. One of them looked up at the massive orc looming above the grave and stopped moving entirely. Corgal took one more step forward. The remaining guard did not wait any longer. He turned and hurried toward the gate, shouting over his shoulder for the others to follow. Within moments, the cemetery path emptied, leaving only the fading sound of boots running across the road beyond the iron fence. Silas pushed the iron cemetery gate closed while the last of the guards stumbled backward onto the road and ran. The metal bars slammed together with a hollow clang that echoed down the foggy path. One of the men nearly tripped while scrambling away from the entrance, his boots slipping on the wet dirt before he regained balance and hurried after the others. Their voices faded quickly into the night, replaced again by the quiet stillness that usually belonged to the graveyard. Silas remained at the gate for a moment, with one hand gripping the iron latch. His breathing came uneven from the struggle. The iron crowbar still hung in his other hand, though the weapon now rested loosely against his leg instead of raised for another swing. Mud covered the lower half of his coat, and the sleeve the guard had grabbed earlier hung torn and stretched. Behind him, Corgal stepped forward along the cemetery path. The fog drifted slowly between the gravestones, parting around her tall shape as she approached the gate. Her armor still carried streaks of dirt from the fall from the mausoleum roof. The bandage beneath the shoulder plate pulled slightly with each step, but she ignored the discomfort. Silas finally slid the iron latch into place. The gate locked with a dull click. He turned slowly and leaned the crowbar against the fence. The tension that had held his body stiff during the fight began to loosen. His hands trembled faintly as he wiped them against his coat, leaving dark smears of wet soil across the fabric. Corgal stopped beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The road outside the cemetery had already fallen silent again. The guards had run fast and far once they realized the fight had turned against them. Silas glanced toward the deeper rows of graves. Several stones had been knocked crooked during the struggle. Loose dirt still marked the edge of the half-dug pit where the two men had fallen. The shovel lay abandoned near a tilted monument, its blade half buried in the soil. Corgal followed his gaze. Her eyes moved slowly across the cemetery, checking the graves the way a warrior might scan a battlefield after the clash had ended. The fresh mound where her brother rested remained untouched. The carved stone markers stood firmly in the earth, the letters catching faint light from the distant town lamps beyond the hill. Corgal stepped away from the gate and walked toward the grave. Silas picked up the crowbar again and followed, his boots crunching quietly along the gravel path. The fog had begun to thin slightly, allowing the outlines of the gravestones to appear more clearly between the rows. They stopped beside the new marker. Corgal placed one large hand against the top of the stone, resting her palm there for several seconds. Her fingers traced the carved lines of the name again, slower this time. Silas watched quietly. The difference between them remained obvious even standing side by side. Her shoulders rose far above his. The armor plates along her chest and arms carried the marks of many battles. Silas's coat hung loosely around narrow shoulders more familiar with shovels and chisels than weapons. Corgal finally turned back toward the cemetery gate. Her voice carried low but clear through the fog. "This ground stands under my clan's protection." Silas blinked once at the statement. Corgal looked across the rows of graves again, then back toward the road where the guards had fled. Her posture remained calm, but the message behind the words was unmistakable. Anyone returning here with the same intentions would not find the cemetery undefended. Silas nodded slowly. The fog drifted quietly around them while the graves stood silent in their careful rows. Far beyond the hill, the first pale hint of morning light began to touch the sky above the cemetery. Morning light reached the cemetery just as Silas set the small iron kettle onto the wooden table outside the cabin. Thin steam rose from the spout, while the first rays of sun slipped through the fading fog between the gravestones. The night's tension had drained away with the darkness, leaving the graveyard quiet again in the way Silas knew best. He placed 2 simple cups beside the kettle and poured the tea carefully so the liquid would not spill across the rough boards. Corgal sat on the porch step nearby. Her long legs stretched across the dirt path while the morning light touched the edges of her armor. The bandage beneath the shoulder plate had been tightened again earlier, the cloth clean and firmly wrapped. She watched the rows of gravestones while Silas worked at the table, her broad back straight but relaxed in a way it had not been during the night. The cemetery looked orderly again. Silas had already returned the fallen shovel to the tool rack beside the cabin. The disturbed earth near the open pit had been packed down. A few crooked markers still waited to be straightened, but the damage from the fight had been small compared to what could have happened if the guards had reached the fresh grave. Silas carried one of the cups to the porch and handed it up to Corgal. The cup looked tiny in her hand, the rim barely wider than 2 of her fingers. She studied the rising steam for a moment before taking a careful sip. The heat curled into the cool morning air. Silas sat down beside her with his own cup. For a while they drank quietly. The fog continued to thin, revealing the full rows of gravestones stretching across the cemetery hill. White marble markers caught the morning light, while older wooden boards leaned slightly in the softer earth. Among them stood the new stone carved with the name Silas had cut into the marble the night before. Corgal's gaze rested there. Her brother's grave now looked like the others. The stone stood straight. The soil around it had settled evenly. No sign remained of the hurried digging or the struggle that followed. Silas followed her gaze and nodded once. The silence between them felt easy now. No tension. No suspicion, only the quiet routine of morning settling into the graveyard. Corgal finally spoke, her voice calm and steady. "Your people fear what they do not know. Silas shrugged slightly and took another drink from his cup. The warm liquid left a thin trail of steam rising past his face. Corgo looked down at the tea again, turning the cup slowly between her fingers as if studying the simple object. "Clans do the same," she added after a moment. Silas did not answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward and set the empty cup on the porch boards. His eyes moved across the cemetery once more, checking the graves the way he did every morning. The markers stood quiet and still under the growing sunlight. Corgal rose slowly to her feet. The porch creaked under her weight as she stepped down onto the path. Her tall figure moved through the gravestones with careful steps until she reached the fresh marker. She rested her hand briefly against the carved name one last time. Silas watched from the porch. After a moment, she turned back toward him. The warrior's expression remained firm, but calmer than when they first met beside the open grave. The cemetery belonged to the dead. Yet now, two very different guardians stood among the stones. Silas lifted the kettle again and poured another small cup of tea, while the morning sun continued to climb above the hill. Far beyond the cemetery walls, the town slowly began to wake, unaware that during the night, grief had spoken the same language on both sides of an old border.